There are places in England where the wind still whispers names no one dares to say aloud. Along the mist-laden marshes of the River Stour, near what is now called Essex, there once stood a village that vanished so completely from the earth that even the grass seemed to forget it had ever grown there. No ruins, no graves, no smoke-blackened beams left behind, only silence. And the silence, they say, is heavier than stone. Before we begin, pause for a moment. Imagine trusting someone who smiles at you across a fire. Imagine offering them bread, shelter, and safe passage through lands your ancestors guarded for centuries. And imagine discovering too late that their gratitude was only patience wearing a mask. If stories like this matter to you, stay with me, and when the weight of truth settles in, remember to like and subscribe, not for the channel, but so these forgotten voices are never buried twice. This is the story of the Icenian ancient British tribe who once roamed the eastern plains long before England bore that name. It is the story of a young warrior named Edric, whose father believed in treaties, and whose mother believed in omens. It is the story of a promise carved into oak, and of fire that erased everything that followed. Something happened in that village, something deliberate, something final, and by the time the smoke cleared, no one remained to tell it except the wind. The Iceni lands stretched across what is now eastern England, from the dense woodlands of present-day Norfolk to the rolling plains that reach toward the River Stour and the marshes near modern-day Essex. In the 1st century after Christ, before stone churches pierced the horizon, and before Roman roads carved their rigid lines through the countryside, this was a place of open skies and iron-forged pride. The Iceni were not a wandering people. They were rooted. Their settlements were ringed with timber palisades, their fields marked by barley and spelt, their cattle grazing beneath low wind-bent oaks. They traded along river routes and minted their own coins, stamped with horses and symbols of sovereignty. To them, land was not owned. It was inherited from the bones beneath it. At the heart of one such settlement, near the estuaries where the Stour met the sea, stood a circular hall built from oak beams blackened by years of hearth smoke. This was the home of Cenric, a respected elder who had fought in his youth against neighboring tribes and later sat in council when Rome's influence began creeping across Britannia. Cenric was not blind to change. He had heard of the southern tribes who bent the knee to Roman governors, of the iron discipline of legions stationed near Camulodunum, now known as Colchester. He believed survival lay not only in strength of sword, but in strength of agreement. His son Edric did not share that belief. Edric had grown up listening to stories of defiance, of Queen Boudicca's uprising decades earlier, when Iceni warriors burned Roman settlements in righteous fury. Though that rebellion had been crushed, its memory still smoldered like peat beneath the soil. To Edric, the Romans were not distant rulers, but patient conquerors. He watched the traders who arrived with amphorae of wine and polished bronze trinkets, watched how some elders accepted gifts and promises of protection. He saw how Roman engineers surveyed land with quiet calculation, what his father called diplomacy. He felt as erosion. The settlement itself seemed peaceful on the surface. Children chased one another between roundhouses. Women dyed wool with woad and madder, and blacksmiths hammered iron into spearheads that gleamed in the low sun. Yet beneath the rhythm of daily life ran an unease that could not be named aloud. Roman envoys had begun appearing more frequently, escorted by auxiliary soldiers recruited from other tribes. They spoke of unity, of prosperity under imperial guidance, of roads that would connect markets and bring wealth. They smiled often, they listened carefully, and they wrote everything down. Cenric welcomed them. He believed that open gates signaled strength rather than weakness. "We cannot fight an empire forever," he once told the council, his voice steady as smoke curled toward the roof beams, "but we can shape how it enters our world." His words were practical, measured, born from a lifetime of watching blood soak into soil that never asked for it. To him, alliance was strategy. To Edric, it felt like surrender disguised as wisdom. If this tension already grips you, if you feel the quiet fracture forming, consider subscribing now, because what follows is not a sudden explosion, but a slow tightening of fate. They arrived with maps. They marked river crossings, counted livestock, assessed the quality of farmland. A small outpost was proposed near the marsh road, ostensibly to protect trade. Some villagers welcomed the idea. Roman coin held value in distant market. Others remained silent. Silence, in those days, was not consent. It was fear, disguised as patience. Edric began spending more nights beyond the palisade, training with younger warriors who still believed in the old ways of resistance. They spoke in low tones about what might happen if Rome decided treaties were no longer useful. And then came the Winter Council. A Roman centurion named Gaius Valerius arrived bearing a formal decree. The Iceni lands, he explained, would retain autonomy under Roman oversight. Taxes would increase modestly. A road would be constructed constructed across their eastern fields. In exchange, Rome would guarantee protection from rival tribes and offer expanded trade rights. The words were polished, the implications were not. Cenric saw compromise. Edric saw encroachment. The villagers saw uncertainty. And uncertainty is the soil where tragedy grows best. What none of them understood was that decisions made in that hall would ripple outward with irreversible force. Trust was being extended like a bridge over dark water, and no one yet knew whether the far side was solid ground or a carefully concealed abyss. The village still stood, smoke rising from hearths into a pale sky, unaware that history was already sharpening its blade. The decree was accepted at dusk, not with celebration, but with a solemn nod of inevitability. Cenric stood before the gathered villagers and declared that the Iceni would hun, or Rome's proposal for now. He spoke of stability, of preserving bloodlines rather than spilling them. Roman engineers would begin surveying the eastern fields at first light. A small detachment of auxiliaries would be stationed near the marsh road to ensure safe passage. The decision felt measured, controlled. Yet as torches flickered against the timber walls of the great hall, Edric felt something fracture quietly inside him. It was not rebellion yet. It was something colder, doubt hardening into certainty. The next morning, the Romans arrived, not with banners raised, but with tools. Gaius Valerius returned, accompanied by surveyors carrying rods and wax tablets, marking distances with deliberate precision. They walked the fields as if already memorizing them, their sandals pressing into soil that had held Iceni footprints for generations. Edric watched from the edge of the barley rows, jaw clenched. He noticed how the Romans rarely asked permission before stepping across boundaries. They moved as if the treaty had already transformed courtesy into authority. And perhaps it had. For weeks, life appeared unchanged. Children still chased dogs through the settlement. The smith's hammer still rang against iron. But now, alongside the familiar rhythms, there was a new sound, the scrape of Roman shovels cutting through earth to lay the foundation of a road. It began as a narrow clearing through the grassland, but its path was straight, uncompromising. Iceni paths curved with the land, respecting hills and sacred groves. Roman roads did not curve. They conquered terrain by ignoring it. Edric could not shake the symbolism. A road, once laid, does not ask who it divides. One evening, Edric confronted his father near the cattle enclosure, where twilight pooled in long shadows. They measure everything, he said quietly. Our grain, our livestock, even the marshes. They call it protection, but they are learning how to take from us. Cenric listened without interruption, his weathered face unreadable. Knowledge is not theft, he replied at last. It becomes theft only if we give them reason to seize it. Edric wanted to argue further, to shout that Rome did not need reason's only opportunity, but he held his tongue. Respect for his father battled with fear for his people, and neither won. As autumn deepened, Roman coin began circulating more frequently through the settlement. Traders brought wine, amphorae, and polished metalware, goods that dazzled some of the younger villagers. A few elders praised the growing prosperity. Taxes, though heavier than promised, were not yet crushing. The centurion maintained a tone of cooperation, even sharing meals within the hall. He laughed at stories, praised Iceni craftsmanship, and spoke of mutual respect between Rome and Britannia. It was convincing, and that was precisely what unsettled Edric most. Empires rarely needed swords when patience would suffice. Then came the first quiet change that no one had voted on. The Roman detachment near the marsh expanded just slightly. A few additional soldiers arrived temporarily. Gaius explained. Due to unrest elsewhere, their camp grew, more fortified. Timber walls were raised around it. Watchtowers appeared, subtle but unmistakable. The villagers were told it was for everyone's safety. Safety from whom? Edric wondered. No rival tribe had threatened the Iceni lands in years. The only new presence in their territory wore Roman armor. If you can feel the tension tightening, if you sense the moment when diplomacy begins to resemble surrender, stay with this story. Leave a like if it resonates, not as entertainment, but as remembrance. Because what follows is not sudden betrayal. It is something slower, more calculated. Trust stretched thin until it snaps without warning. The breaking point came not with fire, but with a census. Roman officials announced they would record every household, every name, every able-bodied man fit for auxiliary service. It was framed as administrative necessity. Cenric agreed publicly, insisting cooperation would prevent harsher measures. But when Roman scribes entered the settlement, their wax tablets in hand, Edric saw fear in the eyes of warriors who had once feared nothing. To be counted is to be known. To be known is to be controlled. controlled. That night, as winds swept across the marshlands and rattled the palisade gates, Edric stood beyond the village perimeter and stared at the Roman campfires, flickering in disciplined rows. He realized something with painful clarity. Rome had not come to destroy them outright. Rome had come to outlast them. And patience, he understood now, could be deadlier than any blade. Winter came early that year, carrying with it a cold that settled deep into bone and thought alike. Frost clung to the barley stubble like ash after a fire, and the marshes near the river Stewer froze in shallow sheets that cracked beneath the feet of grazing cattle. The Roman road, half completed, cut through the white fields like a scar that refused to heal. What had once been soft earth now lay packed and leveled, stones pressed firmly into place by disciplined hands. The Iceni watched it grow in silence. The road did not threaten them openly, yet it changed how the land felt beneath their feet. The census continued through the first weeks of winter. Roman scribes moved from roundhouse to roundhouse, noting names, counting livestock, measuring storage pits. They asked questions with polite detachment. How many sons? How much grain? How many cattle survived the last harvest? Cenric stood beside them when he could, offering reassurance in a steady voice. This is order, he told the villagers. Order prevents chaos. But Edric noticed something else. With each answer given, the Romans' eyes sharpened. Information settled into their wax tablets like seeds planted for a future harvest. It was during this period that the first requisition order arrived, not a request-an order. A portion of stored grain would be transferred to the Roman outpost to support imperial logistics. The amount was described as modest. The timing, however, was cruel. The harvest had been average, not abundant, and winter had only begun. When the wagons came to collect the grain, villagers stood by and watched in tight-lipped stillness. No one resisted. No one spoke. Silence, once protective, had become heavy. Edric confronted Gaius Valerius openly for the first time beside the granary, as sacks were loaded onto Roman carts. You promised prosperity, he said, voice low but firm, not hunger. The centurion did not raise his tone. Prosperity requires contribution, he replied. Rome protects these lands from external threats. Protection has cost. His words were measured, reasonable even. That was the brilliance of it. Each demand sounded justified in isolation. It was only when placed together that the pattern became undeniable. In the evenings, whispers began to circulate among the younger warriors. They met beyond the palisade, near a grove of twisted hawthorns that elders once called sacred. There, beneath branches stripped bare by winter, Edric spoke what others had only dared think. This is how it begins, he told them. Not with flames, but with ledgers. Some nodded in agreement. Others hesitated, torn between fear of Rome and fear of rebellion. The memory of Boudicca's failed uprising lingered like a cautionary tale carved into collective memory. Resistance had once brought glory and ruin. Cenric sensed the shift in his son before anyone else did. One night, he found Edric sharpening his blade longer than necessary beside the hearth. Sparks rose between them. You mistake patience for weakness, Cenric said quietly, and you mistake compliance for survival, Edric answered. Their voices did not rise, but the gulf between them widened. Cenric had lived long enough to see tribes erased by reckless pride. Edric feared they would be erased by cautious submission. If this tension feels familiar, if you recognize the slow tightening of control masked as stabilities, stay with the story. These are the moments history rarely dramatizes. Not the battlefields, but the quiet concessions that make battle inevitable. If this resonates, remember to subscribe so these buried stories continue to breathe beyond this telling. The turning point did not arrive with violence, but with humiliation. A small dispute erupted when Roman soldiers accused an Iceni herdsman of withholding cattle during the census. The accusation was unfounded, yet the soldier struck the herdsman publicly. The blow echoed through the settlement, louder than any war horn. The man fell to the mud, and for a suspended second, every warrior in the village froze. Edric's hand went to his blade. So did several others. Cenric stepped forward first. He approached Gaius Valerius calmly, demanding explanation rather than retaliation. The centurion reprimanded the soldier lightly, but did not apologize. The herdsman was ordered to pay an additional levy for administrative oversight. The crowd dispersed in strained silence. No blood had been spilled, yet something irreversible had shifted. The Romans had crossed an invisible boundary not by killing, but by demonstrating they could strike without consequence. That night, Edric stood alone at the edge of the unfinished Roman road, staring down its unbending line as it vanished into the frost. He imagined legions marching along it, supply wagons rumbling, authority flowing like a river that would not be turned aside. He understood then what patience had cost them. Every compromise had laid another stone beneath Rome's feet, and the stones were nearly set. By late winter, the Roman road was complete. It ran like a pale scar across the eastern fields, cutting straight through land where Iceni children had once raced barefoot in spring flowing mud. The stones were packed tight, the drainage trenches precise, the edges reinforced with timber. It was an impressive feat of engineering. Even some of the elders admitted that it would ease travel between settlements and bring traders more efficiently than river barges alone ever could. But admiration came reluctantly, and never without unease. Because what Rome built, Rome controlled. With the road finished, the traffic increased. Not caravans of merchants, but soldiers. Auxiliaries first, then a small contingent of legionaries disciplined, armored, unmistakably Roman. Their red-dyed cloaks flashed against the grey winter sky as they marched in formation, boots striking the stone in synchronized rhythm. The sound traveled far, echoing across the marshlands like a heartbeat that did not belong to the Iceni. Gaius Valerius assured Cenric that this was temporary. Routine rotation, he called it. A demonstration of Rome's presence to deter unrest. But unrest where? Edric asked, quietly during council. No tribe had threatened the Iceni borders. No raids had occurred. The only tension in the region stemmed from Rome itself. The centurion's answers were smooth, rehearsed. The more he explained, the more the words felt like veils. Then came the conscription notice. It was not framed as conscription, of course. It was an opportunity. Young Iceni men would be invited to serve as auxiliaries in distant Roman campaigns. They would receive pay, citizenship after service, and honor under the imperial banner. The offer was presented as privilege. Refusal, though not explicitly punished, was recorded, and records, the Iceni were learning, had consequences. Later, 3 young men volunteered within the first weak sons of families who had benefited most from Roman trade. They left quietly, escorted by Roman officers, carrying spears, not for their homeland, but for an empire that had never asked for their loyalty, only expected it. The village watched them depart in silence. Some whispered pride, others whispered betrayal. Edric felt the ground shift beneath him. This is how we disappear, he told the Hawthorn Grove gathering that night. Not slaughtered, not burned, diluted, sent away, counted, taxed, absorbed. His voice trembled not with fear, but with urgency. The younger warriors listened more closely now. The public strike against the herdsmen had not been forgotten, nor had the grain taken during winter's leanest days. Each small injustice had layered itself upon the last. The weight was growing. Cenric, meanwhile, carried a different burden. He had believed in measured coexistence. He had trusted that negotiation would preserve Iceni autonomy. But he could no longer ignore what even the quietest villagers now sensed. Rome was not negotiating anymore. It was establishing permanence. One evening, alone in the great hall, he ran his fingers over the carved oak beam that bore the marks of his grandfather's hand. Generations had shaped this place. Now, for the first time, he wondered whether it would survive another. The next incident shattered what remained of illusion. A Roman tax assessor arrived with updated figures, higher levies due to road maintenance costs. Cenric argued openly this time. The fields had yielded modestly, livestock had suffered winter losses, and Rome had already taken grain. Gaius Valerius listened, but his expression was different now, less conciliatory, more administrative. Compliance is not optional, he said flatly. The words landed like a blade, laid gently across the throat. Not shouted, not threatened, simply stated. Edric stood beside his father when the exchange ended. For the first time, he saw doubt in Cenric's eyes, not doubt in Rome, but doubt in himself. Doubt that patience had bought them time. Doubt that diplomacy had preserved anything at all. If you feel the turning point forming, if you sense the quiet before something irreversible, pause here. Because history rarely announces catastrophe with trumpets. It whispers it first. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing now, so when the whisper becomes fire, you won't miss what follows. That night, frost coated the palisade wall. The Roman campfires burned brighter than usual, their glow reflecting off polished helmets stacked neatly by the watchtower. Edric stood outside the gate, long after most villagers had retreated indoors. The wind carried faint laughter from the Roman outpost, laughter in a language that did not belong to this land. For the first time, he no longer saw visitors. He saw occupiers. And somewhere deep beneath the frozen earth, something older than treaties, older than Rome itself, began to stir the instinct not to negotiate, but to survive. Spring arrived hesitantly, as if unsure whether it was welcome. The frost retreated from the marshlands, and thin green shoots pushed through soil that had endured too much weight. Yet the settlement did not feel renewed. The Roman outpost had doubled in size, its watchtower casting a longer shadow over the eastern field. The once distant presence of empire now felt immediate, constant. Soldiers moved freely along the completed road, entering the village without announcement. They did not ask permission anymore. They assumed it. The first true fracture came with an accusation. A Roman supply wagon overturned near the marsh crossing, its cargo lost in mud and shallow water. Within hours, the centurion's men were inside the village claiming sabotage. No proof was offered, no witness named. Yet 3 Iceni youths, boys hardly older than 17, were seized publicly. Edric watched in disbelief as their wrists were bound. Senric demanded explanation, but Gaius Valerius's tone was no longer diplomatic. Order must be maintained, he said. Examples prevent chaos. The word examples hung in the air like smoke. The boys were taken to the Roman camp. By nightfall, rumors had spread. Beatings, interrogation, confessions extracted through pain. Mothers wept outside the palisade gate, begging for news. No one was permitted near the outpost. Edric felt the tension in his chest harden into something sharp and unmovable. This was no longer about taxes or roads. This was about fear being cultivated deliberately. Rome had shifted from persuasion to intimidation, and it did so with calculated calm. Senric sought private audience with the centurion that same evening. He returned hours later, with shoulders bowed in a way Edric had never seen before. The boys would be released, but only after their families paid fines for damages. It was extortion, dressed as law. When the youths were returned at dawn, bruised and hollow-eyed, the village gathered in silent fury. No one cheered their freedom. The cost had been dignity. The cost had been proof that Rome could seize sons at will. That night, the Hawthorn Grove filled with more warriors than ever before. Edric did not need to speak loudly. Anger had found its own voice. They spoke of striking the outpost, of burning the watchtower before Rome could call reinforcements from Camulodunum. Some hesitated, recalling the fate of Boudicca's revolt, how Rome had crushed entire tribes in retaliation. But others argued that submission had brought them only slower ruin. The choice, it seemed, was not between safety and danger. It was between quiet erasure and open defiance. If this moment tightens your breath, pause with it. History often balances on decisions made in groves like this, beneath branches that have seen generations pass. If you're still here, consider leaving a like not as applause, but as witness. Because what happens next was not chaos. It was consequence. Senric confronted his son before dawn. You will destroy everything, he warned, voice trembling not with anger, but with fear. Edric met his father's gaze steadily. Everything is already being taken, he replied. For the first time, neither tried to persuade the other. Love stood between them, heavy and fragile. Senric understood the danger of resistance. Edric understood the danger of waiting longer. Both knew the next step would change the village forever. Before sunrise, a single plume of smoke rose unexpectedly from the Roman camp. Not thick enough for disaster, not small enough for accident. By midday, whispers traveled through the settlement. A storage tent had burned during the night. The cause was unknown. The centurion claimed negligence. But when Edric passed along the edge of the road and saw the tightened formation of guards, the sharpened suspicion in Roman eyes, he knew the fragile bridge of trust had cracked beyond repair. The sky itself seemed altered, no longer wide and open, but pressing downward, as if anticipating fire yet to come. The smoke from the burned Roman tent did not linger long in the sky, but it lingered in memory. Officially, the centurion declared it an accident, careless handling of oil lamps. Unofficially, the camp tightened like a clenched fist. Guards doubled. Curfews were imposed under the guise of security. No Iceni was permitted beyond the palisade after moonrise without Roman escort. The road that once symbolized trade now functioned as a controlled artery, monitored day and night. Trust had not only cracked, it had been replaced with suspicion. Edric knew the fire had not been random. Two of the younger warriors had acted without his command, driven by anger over the captured boys. Their intent had been symbolic, a warning, not a declaration of war. But Rome did not distinguish between symbol and rebellion. Within days, new decrees followed. Additional grain levies, mandatory labor to maintain imperial infrastructure. The village that had once negotiated terms was now receiving instructions. Senric read each order aloud with visible strain, his voice steady but thinner than before. The first act of open defiance came quietly, when Roman labor overseers demanded 10 Iceni men to reinforce the road's embankment near the marsh. None stepped forward. The silence was deliberate. It was the kind of silence that carries intent rather than fear. The overseer marked the refusal in his tablet and departed without argument. That calm departure frightened Edric more than threats would have. Rome rarely responded in haste. It responded in scale. 3 nights later, they came, not as a full legion, but as a detachment of disciplined soldiers who moved with practiced coordination. They entered the settlement before dawn, targeting homes at random. Doors were kicked inward. Men were dragged into the mud, accused of conspiracy. This time, there were no fines offered for release. 5 were taken. Among them was Brannock, Edric's closest friend since childhood. Senric protested openly, invoking treaty clauses that now sounded hollow. Gaius Valerius listened without expression and reminded him that Rome's patience was not infinite. The village fractured emotionally that morning. Mothers wailed openly. Warriors paced like caged animals. Children watched with confusion that would later become memory. Edric felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. The burned tent had provoked escalation. His restraint had not prevented it. Rome had moved from subtle control to calculated intimidation, and there was no doubt now the Iceni were being positioned as an example to neighboring tribes. Compliance would be extracted. Resistance would be crushed. If you feel the inevitability building, if you sense how small sparks can ignite forests, stay with the story. These are the chapters that rarely survive in written record. If you're still listening, consider subscribing so the echoes of villages like this are not silenced. Twice that evening, Edric stood beside the marsh as the tide crept inward under a dim sky. The Roman watchtower torches flickered against the water's surface. He realized something with painful clarity. Rome was not reacting to rebellion. It was creating it. By tightening its grip, it ensured that defiance would justify harsher force. The strategy was ruthless and brilliant. Either submit fully or provoke annihilation. Behind him, the village lights dimmed one by one as families barred their doors. No council was called that night. No formal decision was made. But in the quiet between heartbeats, the truth settled across the settlement like mist over the Stour. The bridge of negotiation had burned. What remained was a narrow path forward, one that led either into deeper submission or into fire. The 5 taken were not returned. Days passed, then a week. No ransom was requested. No charges were formally declared. When Cenric demanded audience with Gaius Valerius, he was denied entry to the Roman outpost. Sent for the first time since negotiations had begun months earlier, the refusal was not loud. It was procedural. Imperial matters, a guard explained without meeting his eyes. The message was unmistakable. The Iceni were no longer partners under treaty. They were subjects awaiting instruction. Rumors reached the village through traders traveling the new road. The detained men had been transported south toward Camulodunum, Rome's colonial stronghold in the region. Not imprisoned locally, not disciplined and released, but removed. Exile disguised as justice. Edric felt the final thread of patience snap. Within him, Brannock was more than a friend. He was a future leader among the younger warriors. To take him was to hollow the next generation. The council convened that night in the great hall, the air thick with smoke and fear. For the first time, voices rose openly against Cenric. Your treaties have delivered. Our sons into chains. One elder said bitterly. Cenric did not argue. He could not. He had believed compromise would shield them. Instead, each concession had emboldened Rome. The old man looked suddenly aged, as though the burden of miscalculation had pressed years into his bones in a single season. Edric stepped forward, not in anger, but with clarity sharpened by inevitability. They are isolating us, he said, removing those who would resist, weakening us piece by piece. If we do nothing, we will wake one day to find Roman law, the only law, Roman gods, the only gods, and our children speaking their tongue. The hall fell silent. Even those who feared rebellion could no longer deny the pattern. Rome was not coexisting. It was absorbing. Outside, the Roman presence grew colder. Patrols moved through the settlement without courtesy. 2 more homes were searched under claims of hidden contraband. Sacred groves near the marsh were marked with Roman symbols, indicating future clearing for expansion. The Iceni watched sacred land reduced to logistical space. What had once been ancestral earth was now a planned extension of empire. The insult cut deeper than taxation. It was spiritual erasure. If this feels like the moment before a storm breaks, if you sense how restraint turns to inevitability, pause here. These are the breaths history holds before it exhales catastrophe. If this story grips you, consider leaving a like or subscribing, not for spectacle, but for memory, because what comes next will not be subtle. That night, beneath the hawthorn grove, the warriors did not debate whether to resist. They debated how. The decision was no longer philosophical. It was tactical. Edric proposed striking the outpost, directly burning supplies, collapsing the watchtower, forcing Rome to respond openly rather than tightening slowly. Some feared full retaliation from nearby legions. Others argued that annihilation delayed was annihilation guaranteed. The choice had narrowed to 2 grim paths: die slowly under compliance, or risk swift destruction with dignity mostly intact. Cenric arrived at the grove unannounced. The warriors parted silently. He did not forbid them. He did not plead for patience. Instead, he looked at his son with an expression stripped of illusion. "If you do this," he said quietly, "there will be no return." Edric held his father's gaze. "There is no return left." The old man closed his eyes briefly, as though mourning a future already lost. Then he nodded once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement. The Iceni would no longer wait, and Rome, patient architect of control, would soon discover that pressure, applied long enough, does not always create submission. Sometimes it creates fire. They chose the tide. Edric knew the marshlands better than any Roman surveyor ever could. When the water withdrew under the pull of the moon, it exposed narrow stretches of firm ground between reeds and silt paths, invisible to outsiders, safe only for those who had walked them since childhood. The plan was simple, almost desperate. Strike fast at the Roman outpost, while much of the detachment slept, burn the grain stores and signal towers, and disappear back into the wetlands before reinforcements could organize. It was not a campaign, it was a message. The warriors moved without drums, without war cries, faces streaked with mud, cloaks darkened to swallow moonlight. They slipped beyond the palisade, as if the village itself exhaled them into the marsh. Edric felt no triumph, only a tightening resolve. Brannock's absence burned in his mind. The boys taken in chains. The humiliation, the slow suffocation of autonomy. This was not vengeance alone, it was refusal. They reached the perimeter unseen. The watchtower loomed above the outpost, its silhouette cutting into the pale sky. Two sentries paced the lower wall, unaware of the figures moving beneath reed cover. At Edric's signal, stones flew, first silent, deliberate. One guard fell before he could shout. The second managed a brief cry, cut short by a spear. For a suspended heartbeat, there was stillness. Then the warriors surged forward. Flames caught quickly in the supply. Tents, oil jars overturned. Grain stores ignited with a deep, hungry roar. The watchtowers, wooden supports, splintered under axes that had once cut only timber for homes. Roman soldiers stumbled from barracks half-armed. Confusion etched across their faces. Edric saw fear. There not the theatrical fear of negotiation, but real shock. For months, Rome had believed control was tightening. It had not expected fire from within the marsh. Steel met steel. The clash was brutal and unrefined. Iceni warriors fought with ferocity, born from desperation. Roman legionaries responded with drilled discipline. In the chaos, the neat geometry of empire fractured. The road itself glowed orange as embers scattered across its stone. For a fleeting moment, Edric believed they might succeed not in defeating Rome, but in wounding its certainty. Then the horn sounded. From beyond the outpost, farther down the road, another Roman detachment advanced. Reinforcements had been stationed closer than anyone realized. The empire had anticipated unrest, perhaps even engineered it. Torches appeared in disciplined rows, shields locking together as they approached. The realization struck Edric with icy clarity. This outpost was never alone. "Withdraw," he shouted. Some heard him, some did not. The marsh paths that had offered stealth now offered confusion under smoke and blood. Warriors fell some to Roman blades, others to missteps in dark water. Edric cut his way toward the reeds, dragging a wounded companion behind him. Behind his shoulder, the watchtower collapsed in sparks and flame. It felt like victory. It was not, if you feel your chest tighten here, if you sense that fire does not always free what it touches, stay with the story. This was the moment the line was crossed beyond return. By dawn, the Roman outpost smoldered, but it still stood. More importantly, Rome still stood. The Iceni settlement did not yet know what would follow, but Edric did. As he reached the far edge of the marsh and turned to see smoke rising against the pale morning sky, he understood the cost had only begun to reveal itself. Empires do not forgive humiliation. They erase it. Rome did not respond in anger. It responded in certainty. By midday, the road trembled beneath the march of a full legion summoned from Camulodunum. Shields locked in disciplined formation, standards rising above. The column like iron promises, they advanced not toward negotiation, but toward correction. The burned outpost had not crippled them. It had justified them. What Edric had intended as defiance, Rome framed as rebellion. And rebellion, in imperial language, required demonstration. The Iceni village saw them before. They heard them, the flash of bronze and iron against the pale spring sky. Panic rippled through the settlement. Some gathered weapons, others gathered children. Cenric stood in the center of the great hall, face hollow with understanding. He knew what a legion meant. He had seen the aftermath of Boudicca's defeat years earlier, fields salted with corpses, settlements leveled so thoroughly that only crows remembered their names. Edric returned before before the legion reached the palisade. Mud still clung to his boots. Bloodsome his most knot darkened his tunic. When his eyes met his father's, no words were needed. The bridge had burned. The fire had summoned something far larger than either of them could now stop. There would be no terms offered, no fines, no procedural warnings. The first volley came without herald. Roman archers positioned beyond spear range loosed arrows in disciplined arcs that fell into the settlement like sudden rain. Roof thatch caught flame almost instantly. Panic shattered what little order remained. Warriors rushed forward, meeting the legion's shield wall in a clash that lasted minutes but felt endless. The Iceni fought with fury, but fury cannot break formation forged by empire. Step by step, the legion advanced, pushing through gates, through homes, through memory itself. Cenric fell near the entrance of the great hall. He did not fall dramatically. There was no speech, no last command. A spear found its mark, and he dropped beside the oak beam carved by his grandfather's hand. Idrik saw it happen from across the square, saw the breath leave his father's body. For a heartbeat, everything slowed. The smoke, the screams, the pounding of shields. In that moment, Idrik understood the terrible symmetry. His father had trusted in treaties. He had trusted in fire. Both had been wrong. If this moment weighs heavy on you, pause with it, because this is where villages vanish, not in legend, but in method. The legion showed no hesitation. Roundhouses were set ablaze deliberately. Storage pits were collapsed. Livestock scattered or slaughtered. Those who resisted were cut down. Those who fled toward the marsh were hunted along the very paths that had once offered secrecy. Rome had learned the terrain well during months of peace. There were no blind spots left. By dusk, nothing remained standing. The great hall collapsed inward, oak beams cracking as embers swallowed them. The hawthorn grove, where warriors once whispered plans, was trampled into mud. The Roman standard was planted briefly at the center of the ruins, not to claim the land permanently, but to mark that correction had been delivered. By nightfall, the legion withdrew, leaving no garrison. There was no need. The message had been carved deeply enough. When the smoke thinned, the next morning, only ash lay where homes once stood. No formal record listed the village by name. No Roman chronicle detailed its destruction. It became a footnote, without Inca lesson, absorbed silently by neighboring tribes, who watched from afar and learned what defiance cost. And somewhere beyond the marsh, reeds, wounded but breathing, Idrik lay hidden among blackened earth and cooling embers, staring at a sky that felt unbearably empty. The village had not surrendered. It had been erased. By the third day, even the smoke was gone. Rain moved in from the North Sea, sweeping across the marshes and flattening the last stubborn plumes of ash. The river Stewer flowed, as it always had, indifferent to empire, indifferent to grief. Where roundhouses once stood, there were only darkened circles in the soil. The Roman road remained intact, cold, straight, unbothered by what it had carried. Travelers would pass over it within weeks, perhaps commenting on the quiet beauty of the marshland, never knowing that beneath their sandals lay the memory of a people who had once trusted too carefully, resisted too late, and paid too fully. Idrik did not die that day. He crawled through reeds and mud until the sounds of legionaries faded entirely. Wounded in the shoulder, burned along his forearm, he survived, because the marsh that had once sheltered his ancestors now hid him like a final act of mercy. For days he lay between water and earth, listening for pursuit that never came. Rome did not need to hunt survivors. Its lesson had already been delivered. Erasure was more efficient than imprisonment. When he finally returned to the settlement's remains, he walked slowly, as if stepping into a dream he hoped would dissolve. The oak hall was a skeleton of charred beams. The carved mark of his grandfather's hand had split and blackened beyond recognition. He found Cenric where he had fallen, though little remained that could still be called a body. Idrik knelt beside the ash and pressed his uninjured hand into the earth. No tears came. Grief, like fire, sometimes consumes too much to leave moisture behind. There were other survivors, fewer than a dozen, scattered along the marsh edge, hiding among reeds or beneath collapsed fencing. Mothers without children, children without pa, NTs, warriors without a village to defend. They gathered in silence, not in council, but in mourning. No one spoke of rebuilding. The road was too close, the legion too near. Rome had not merely destroyed structures, it had dismantled possibility. If this story has stayed with you, if the quiet devastation feels heavier than the battle itself, pause here. Leave a like, not for spectacle, but for remembrance. Subscribe so that villages erased from stone are not erased from memory. Because this is how histories disappear, not through forgetting alone, but through silence. In time, the land reclaimed what Rome left behind. Grass returned, wildflowers pushed through soot. The marsh birds nested where homes once stood. Travelers who passed years later would see nothing unusual, only open land beside a well-built road. Some might notice fragments of pottery unearthed after heavy rain. Some might wonder why the soil in that patch seemed darker than the rest, but no marker told them that an Iceni settlement settlement once stood there, that a father trusted too long, that a son resisted too late. Idrik never rebuilt on that ground. He left the store behind and moved westward, toward lands less mapped, less measured. He carried with him no banner, no army, no victory, only memory. In distant settlements, he would sometimes speak of what had happened not to incite rebellion, but to warn of patience mistaken for safety, and rage mistaken for strategy. Empires, he learned, do not need to destroy every tribe openly. They need only destroy one completely and let the wind carry the lesson. The village was not recorded. In Roman archives, it did not become a celebrated battle. It did not inspire monuments. It was simply gone vahida, the mapa swept from the page of Empire's accounting. But the wind remembers. It moves across the store and through the marsh reeds, whispering names that no stone preserve. And perhaps that is the only resistance left this telling, this refusal to let erasure be complete. Because land can be burned, homes can be leveled, roads can outlast generations, but memory, when carried forward, cannot be conquered so easily. And somewhere beneath the grass, beside that ancient Roman road, the earth still holds the warmth of a village that once believed trust would protect it. It did not, but their story survives here.